Hi, I'm Jacob Brogan. I'm an assistant editor with the Washington Post and a huge fan of all the people that we have here today. We're going to be talking about politics and comics and cartooning and the relationship between them. Why don't you all, I guess, introduce yourselves to get us going? Bob, do you want to start?
Sure. My name is Sikoryak, and I'm a cartoonist, obviously. My new book is called Constitution Illustrated.
Mr. Fish, would you like to?
Right as I'm drinking something. Yes, so my name is Dwayne Booth. My pen name is Mr. Fish, and my new book is called Nobody Left.
Ezra, would you like to tell us who you are?
My name is Ezra Claytan Daniels. I'm a writer and illustrator, and my new book with Ben Passmore, who's also on this panel, is called Bottom Feeders.
And Ben Passmore.
My name is Ben Passmore. I'm not only the illustrator on Bottom Feeders, I'm also a frequent NIB contributor, and I had a book come out last spring, I guess, called Sports as Hell through Koyama Press.
And finally, Ann Telnaes.
I'm Ann Telnaes. I'm editorial cartoonist for the Washington Post, and my older book is Trump's ABC, but it still works.
Sadly.
So let's start with what political comics are for. Political comics and political cartooning are for, to your minds, in this moment. You all do a work in different styles and in different ways. You're tackling different issues, from the kind of explicit interrogation of the Trump administration and its reverberations throughout our current moment that we find in Ann's work, to the really savage critique of gentrification and the racial politics thereof that we find in Bottom Feeders, to Mr. Fish's really knotted and naughty and fascinating interrogation of what leftist thought looks like, to our Sikoryak's juxtaposition-based interrogation of the kind of texts that shape our everyday lives, from the US Constitution to the terms of service that we sign on to use an iPad like the one that I am talking to you all on. What are we doing with political comics? What can we achieve with them? Or alternately, what are you all trying to achieve with them? Do you want to kick us off?
I can answer that
sure.
broadly, because I think we're going to get into some specifics regarding how each one of us engages with that question. But I would say that probably, generally, I think that my mission, and I think everybody else's mission, is to create art that has political content or cultural commentary in there, and makes it accessible to people who are either turned off by how ugly, the public discourse can be regarding politics, or how very often political talk on television it's definitely, you've got two teams now, and they're very shrill in how they engage with this subject. So in order to engage with it in an honest way and pull people into the conversation in the general public, you want to give them something that looks like real language, real life, real human drama, minus all of the political nonsense that actually makes people disenfranchises everybody's interest in the subject, I would say.
Yeah.
Furthermore,
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, that's interesting, because I mean, I obviously I come from a more boring mainstream editorial cartooning than the rest of you, and I've been in this for quite a while. You know, it wasn't quite as polarized when I got in. I mean, obviously there were sides, but it wasn't like it is today. I think for my work, since I'm kind of more in the traditional editorial cartooning, I always feel like my work is more a question than anything else. It's sort of like presenting a question to the public, not giving them any answers, but just, looking at something maybe from a different way. I have to tell you one thing in terms of historically, this time specifically, right now, I have never had so many engaged readers in my entire career, and I've been doing this for 30 years. I've always had people, specifically, during some really testy issues, like gun control or abortion or whatever, they always, you kind of hear from them more. But now I'm hearing consistently from people who aren't just, mad at me, but are actually engaged and appreciative and want to participate. I'm sure all of us get suggestions from people like what to do cartoon-wise. I'm not kidding. I got 10 suggestions in a span of 2 days, which has never happened. It's just people, I think they really they can participate through editorial cartooning, whatever form it is, if it's traditional, if it's multi-panel, if it's graphic, essays or whatever. People are engaged, and I think that's what's really important right now.
Does the visual, do you think, give people a different way in, different access to these issues?
You're asking me?
Sure. Yeah. Sorry. You can never tell who anyone's looking at.
I don't want to monopolize it. Just I think that cartoons, broadly cartoons, everyone can read a cartoon, even if you can't read. It's just something, and it reaches beyond languages and countries, and it's just a way for every human being to engage. I think that's the reason it's so attractive to people, and they can identify with it. And what else I think is even more important that I've realized in the last couple of years, it transcends class lines. It's even the filthy rich can enjoy a cartoon at their expense, right? So I think that's where the power is the images.
I wonder if you guys agree with this idea that I've been thinking about the fact that cartoons are slightly less easy to misconstrue than the written word. I think it's easier to convey a clear intent with a cartoon. I keep thinking about like when someone leaves a comment on a post that's like not like if someone leaves a comment and I don't know who they are, it's often difficult for me to parse like how they lean, because the language that they use is like, if you pile on these buzzwords and different terms that can be strung together to make a loosely coherent idea, but it's really difficult to parse sometimes what the actual intent behind it is. But when you're looking at an image in a cartoon, I feel like it's a lot of times easier, even if it's just aesthetically easier. Like I forget what the painter's name who paints those pictures of Trump, or like a Terry Redland style. Like if I saw a political cartoon that was drawn in like a Terry Redland style, I would know that was like, just at a glance, I'd be like, oh, this is a right-leaning cartoon. But I think like aesthetically it's easier to parse those.
Yeah, I guess I was like reflecting on like the overall like a most basic sort of definition of what political cartoons were, or my understanding. And I was thinking about how I came up, and my understanding of political cartoons, editorial cartoons, they were in the newspaper, at the drugstore back in the day, and they seemed to either be trying to sort of make a summation of what they were writing about, or they were trying to refer to an assumed position. And sometimes I wonder, because I think Ezra's question is interesting, and I am responding to it. But something I think I often wonder is the sort of clarity of position in political comics, quote unquote. Is that a feature of comics themselves, or are we responding to the tradition of comics itself? Like in some ways, it's sort of bothersome to me that comics, at least my experience, at the Nib is basically where I do a lot of my just quote unquote straightforward little political comics. These sort of function mainly as sort of here are my beliefs, here's the funny 4-panel comic that sort of replicates this. Yeah, so in some ways I feel like it's I think my overall sort of concern with comics is that they don't I don't feel like they add to discourse because they sort of replicate sort of pre-existing discourse and don't challenge very much.
I'd be curious, Bob, if you have thoughts on that, since what your work does for much of your recent work, for readers who aren't familiar with it, is recreates classic images from comics history, comics traditions, with superimposed text where the characters are speaking language from some kind of canonical thing. So you could have in your book Terms of Service, for example, you get Steve Jobs as Jim Steranko's version of Nick Fury, speaking part of the Apple Terms of Service, or in your new Constitution book, you have uncanny recreations of characters from Alison Bechdel's Dykes to Watch Out For, talking about the apportionment of senators. Is there something about this appeal to comics history, to the way that we've read comics and shared them and thought about them in the past, that gives us a different access to these other texts that shape our political lives?
I hope so. It's interesting for me because I always loved to parody comics, and I felt when I started, which was back in the 80s, I felt like I was, by using these styles that people were familiar with, I was able to sort of bring them in, even if, regardless of what the content of the words was, the images would be something familiar to them that they could kind of relate to or remember, maybe fondly or maybe not fondly. I try not to just use classic comics. I've been trying to use contemporary comics as well in my most recent work, and I'm trying to let people in with the associations they have with those images. So the images often play against the text. But especially in Constitution Illustrated, I was really trying to illustrate the text. Unlike Terms and Conditions, which was the Apple book, or my book on Trump, the Constitution book really is trying to illuminate the text in a very straightforward way. I mean, obviously, there's sly references and there's some undercurrent of opinions beneath it, but I'm really hoping that the styles will lure people in to a text that, I hadn't read before I started doing the book. So I think everyone does have a visceral reaction to images, and that's what I'm playing with. Does that answer your question?
It sure does.
Okay.
But it also maybe speaks to that notion of a visceral reaction. Maybe speaks to what Anne is getting at. That people really do respond to this. This is for any of you. What are you doing? What do you see yourself doing when you create political comics or politically focused comics in this moment? Are you tossing drowning people a spar that they can hold on to as they kind of kick their way through the waves, or is it a weapon that you want to offer? Are you trying to give them something that they can use to change the world, not just stay afloat in it?
I think it's even a harder job for us. Because I would say that, at least for me, what I'm trying to do the hard job of teaching people how to swim. I'm not trying to show. I'm not going to throw them a weapon if they're drowning, and I'm also not going to send them a life preserver, because that's just a temporary. It's not even a fix. So the way I approach my stuff, I assume intelligence. And I try to lure people into difficult conversations that they have to participate in. Certainly there's a lot of my stuff that I do that seems sort of bombastic and shutting down of conversations. But I would say that's only to the people who aren't used to having difficult conversations. And those are the people that, if they have a visceral emotional reaction and they're angry about what I do, then they're forced to say that I shouldn't be doing it. And then at least we're having a conversation about free speech. Forget about the content of what I'm creating. But for me, and just getting back to what Ben was saying about, and I agree with him, sometimes cartooning does oversimplify things and sometimes can be very one-note and can treat politics in a way that oversimplifies things and can minimize the true criminality of somebody like Trump by just simply calling them either a clown or a monster. You know, that satisfies people's disdain for the guy, but it doesn't even attempt to educate what is wrong with our system, you know, and how somebody like that can become elected and how they're enabled in this process. So again, I find the question is always one that I feel like we must get a lot. And I always feel like it's my mission to actually broaden our mission, because I think it is broader.
I feel like my approach and perspective is constantly shifting. I feel like for a long time, I've used genre as a delivery mechanism for my political ideals. Like, I feel like that's what Bottom Feeders was specifically designed to do, is like present this fun sci-fi comedy story that has these underlying themes of anti-racism and anti-gentrification. But I'm becoming increasingly disenchanted with that approach because I feel like it's too easy to misconstrue those ideas. And I feel like at best, certainly with the venues that I've been afforded, I feel like the best I can do is provide people bullet points with which to take, with which to argue with their problematic relatives over Thanksgiving dinner, because I'm not really communicating to people outside my political circle. Like, having a book published by Fantagraphics is not reaching anybody in a red state that I actually need a challenge. So I think
they have Fantagraphics has a web store. I mean, you know, it's around.
So that's my current disenchantment, is trying to figure out ways to reach people that need to be reached instead of just speaking into the, what do they call it, the echo chamber.
Yeah, in some ways while I think I definitely appreciate the question, I feel like unsure about like the metaphor, you know what I mean? Like,
sure.
And sort of in some ways, in part because I feel sort of reactionary by sort of like the conversation, like we are more divided than we were before, or like it feels sort of similar to like, in some ways it feels ahistorical, just just based on my understanding of history, you know what I mean? Like, in some ways communities are louder, you know what I mean? So for me, I already assume like a positionality, you know what I mean? Like I am a product of my parents and their parents and the society that they grew up in, and the stories and lessons that they've told about themselves, in some cases versus other people, like I come from a mixed background. So, like, you don't have to go very far back in generations where my two families are operating at opposing ends, or rather one is trying to survive and the other is cutting out, the foundations they're trying to build. So when I'm making comics, I feel like I'm not talking to someone who is feeling a desperation of drowning. Maybe in some cases when I'm writing about Black liberation, but in other cases, people are, they're already on a trajectory. And I feel like I try to speak to the beam that they're on, or maybe sort of talk about the other things that sort of exist. Yeah.
Ben and I talk about this all the time. We're both biracial dudes, and we both are not, well, we're reconciling our proximity to whiteness. Me more than Ben, if by virtue of being lighter than Ben, but also, but I feel like I have a unique position as someone who's white passing in most positions to actually have difficult conversations that my darker skinned relatives can't have. So I feel like that's my duty to push things further, and also to sort of communicate these ideals to problematic relatives.
Is comics a space in which those conversations can happen? That may be another way to think about the question I was trying to think through, and to think through the question I was trying to ask earlier, however clumsily. What can you achieve with comics? Who do you reach, and how are you trying to reach them? And you talked about hearing a lot more from readers, at least in this moment. What do you think is going on there? In what way are you reaching them? In what way are these comics resonating right now?
Well, I do think this is a very unique moment. And one of the things we should probably talk about is the role of social media in all this. Because even though readers have contacted me in various ways throughout the years. I mean, you know, when I first started, it was basically they would write letters to the editor, you know, and then when you got email, then they would try to email you directly, which was a pain. You know, and then with social media, I mean, social media is really where my work lives, even though, you know, my stuff is seen on the Post. And that's where the engagement is. So I think that's a really important part of it. For me, I mean, going back to what everybody is addressing and, you know, where they think their role is, I mean, since I do work for the Washington Post, you know, this is ground zero, right? This is where all the awfulness is, you know, it's concentrated there in a big orange blob. So I have found myself, you know, in this last few years, that's all I've been doing, is I've been doing Trump specific, how he's ruining the entire world, basically. I mean, to be, you know, kind of glib about it. But, you know, that wasn't my whole career. I mean, prior to that, you know, I would do a lot of other topics, you know, starting out with a lot of women's issues and stuff. But right now, I really do feel a kind of a sense of urgency. I mean, talking about drowning, I'm the one who's drowning. I feel like all I do every day is stand on top of my desk and scream through my work, just trying to get someone's attention to what's going on. I don't know if it's working, but that's what I just feel is sort of my mission right now is, you know, my position, what I do, where I am, you know, I want to make sure that I'm on record as pointing this stuff out. You know, what's
does that square with how others you approach your work? And Ben, you talk about, if I understood right, not seeing this moment as purely exceptional, seeing it, I guess, as one that's engaged in deep continuity with other evils and other crises and other problems. But do the rest of you find that you are kind of consumed by our political moment, whether or not it is wholly distinct from the before times?
Absolutely.
In the work you're doing?
Totally. I totally do. I think back at what I've done the last few years, and I put out Terms and Conditions, the Apple service book, not authorized, of course. I just took their text and made a comic out of it. But I did that during the Obama years, and I can't help but feel like that was some clear response to the technocrat world that I felt I was part of. And maybe it was the media elite bubble I'm in New York, I don't know. But when Trump was about to be elected and I was terrified, it totally shifted my work. And I did a book about him specifically. I don't usually do work that specific about topical events, current events. But he totally consumed me, and I was so glad when I finished that book. I wanted to get away from him. But the Constitution is also kind of a response to where I feel like we're at now. I didn't want to do a book that would have an expiration date of this November, God willing. But I did want to do something that spoke to the moment that, well, hopefully the Constitution will last into next year, is what I'm saying.
What about you, Mr. Fish?
I don't even remember what the question was. I just,
Are you consumed by our current political moment? Are you able to? Or is Trump all you can do? Or
no, I do. I can do lots of other things because I do think my rage is very deep and wide, and my complaints are very deep and wide. I mean, for a long time, I've just been feeling this the cheapening of the culture just has been steady to me, you know. And then when I think that. I think that Trump we could have a whole 3 hours talking about why Trump is in there. But I think one of the things that is primary is how shallow political discourse has become, you know. And I think that that's why there's somebody like Trump. And that's why all of the conversations that we've been having are very much like, you know, team sports, shouting and real, absolute hatred. Like real disdain for people that we disagree with. And I feel like that's always sort of been around, but yes, I do think the stakes are very, very, very high right now. one thing when I was, this is just diverting from myself, because I just find myself unable to really talk about this in any really profound way, because we're talking about like an emotional issue, you know. That's as Anne was talking about, you know, I've seen her scream. I know what it looks like when she's on her desk and screaming at things. And I think I do think that's an important thing to do, because what we haven't fully acknowledged yet is that we're trying to create political conversation that does look like it's coming from a human being and human situations, right? And people do not want to feel like they're alone in the turmoil right now, right? So I do think that it's really important sure, I'll stand and scream and I'll jump up and down, I'll do things like that. But I also want to keep my head level enough to have conversations that do bring it back to some sort of center, because I'm sure that we all have relatives in our families that we find reprehensible when it comes to their politics. Absolutely reprehensible. And I hope that I'm able to find some place to have conversations about values without falling into the political mutation that is so ugly. To be reminded that the people that I disagree with politically are also human beings. And I think that that's a really important thing to just keep in mind. And that's what I really try to do. So I try not to panic, is essentially what I'm trying to say.
You know, just to bounce off of what Fish said a little while ago, I was a little simplistic about it. I don't just mean Trump, period. I mean Trump and every issue he touches, and has frankly brought up all the inherent problems with it. You know, the fact that we have a lack of education in this country. People don't know how to read the news. They don't really even know what news is. They don't know how to second source. The entertainment news, I mean, look what that has gotten us now, because people expect to be entertained. So when I say Trump, that's what I'm sort of including, kind of the wide circle that he has somehow managed to make worse. So, and also, in terms of what Fish is saying too about, you know, I agree about the center, you know, that you can't hate everyone. You can't have black and white and just, you know, dismiss everyone. I don't really feel like that's not really where my work is right now. I feel like I'm sort of got a little bell and I'm like shaking it furiously, saying, you know, danger, you know, people, you know, you think that America isn't capable of falling into a autocratic dictatorship, you know, but we're really close to it. And, you know, that's what I feel like my role is, because of the perch I'm on. You know, it's different for different people, you know, what they're doing with their work.
So we're talking, oh, sorry, Ben, I didn't mean to catch up.
Oh, I mean, I guess I was going to bounce off something Fish said too, and something that I feel like I have conversations with other cartoonists, but I think this is just sort of like, the sentiment I think has sort of been said across entertainment in general. Like we're sort of in an environment where it's like, especially after COVID, it's like you can't create like some sort of dystopian, sarcastic narrative about the world in an attempt to critique it. Like we're in it, right? And something that I agree. It's like in some ways, because there is no sort of like mutually understood truth, you know. I don't think there ever was one personally, but you know, like generally it's like, right, you read the news, you know, whatever, it doesn't seem to matter. Like my mother thinks she's a conspiracy theorist, she just is on Reddit all the time. But I think that the key thing is like, you know, we are all people, you know. There is and I think in all of this and the spectacle of late capitalism, we lose track of each other's humanity quite a bit. And in some ways, it does feel like the project of comics could possibly one that is, you know, reminding ourselves and each other of our humanity, that we want to preserve each other's happiness in life. I guess that's the most heard.
I just want to say, because I love that. And I think this segues into a thing that I think everybody probably has an opinion on. Because what we're talking about, you know, what we cartoon about and what we create art about, but just the act of creating art, just as a language, I would argue it's obviously, I'm going to probably say it's the most important form of language that there is, and I think I can actually back it up if you just go with me here for just a second. when it comes to difficult conversations and ones where somebody can actually portray unpopular ideas even, so people can get the opportunity to engage with them without trying to shut them down, that's art, that's the theater. So if we consider what we do a form of theater, that people are actually coming in and filling the seats, sitting in front of us so we can engage with them, as the performers and the creators of the artwork that we're portraying, we can absolutely talk about anything using any language that we want, because people are already in the mindset where we're in the theater and we are going to be able to engage with this stuff. We are going to be grown-ups in this. You know, if you see the Book of Mormon, who has seen the Book of Mormon, the show? The Book of Mormon, okay. So there's a thing, I can't use the language in a lot of this show, but I went and saw a matinee. It was full. I was easily the youngest person by 20 years, right? So I'm surrounded by people who are in their 70s, 80s, and even 90s. And there's a song in there right before the intermission that is F God, over and over again. It is just a huge number. You can't get any more obscene or, upsetting as that. But people knew that this was a show, and in the context of the narrative of what they were looking at, that song ends, and I'm surrounded by like 80 people who, if they could stand, they would, but they're standing and they're clapping, they've got little cameos on, they're like, isn't this delightful? So they were able to engage with this material using the most extreme language. I think that as political commentators, I think it's really important to embrace that and support that idea, because we're not out on the street shouting obscenities. We're inviting people into a space where we say there may be obscenities, there may be difficult things, but you know what? Bad ideas belong in art, because that's how we understand them and engage with them, and maybe then point to them when they're in the political realm and in the public sphere and say, this is nonsense. This has got to stop, because we actually understand why this is toxic, because art has taught us that.
Well, Fish, I think to go back to the Book of Mormon, I think that that's a good example of what we're talking about here, because in musical theater, the low point of the show is always right before the intermission, right? Like that's the construction that everyone understands. So it's the same way comics sort of have that genre or that approach that we can kind of accept because we know that's what we're going to get. So that frame kind of gives it the format that those ideas can live within.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've always, oh, sorry.
I was going to say, I don't want to be like the pessimist in the group, but I would just like have a question for everybody, which is that, have you heard from your readers or fans that the work that you've done has significantly changed their perspective on something? In a way that you intended?
I have.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it requires like multiple things. I would be very surprised if like I made a comic and the comic by itself sort of was the thing that, but yeah, I mean, more than one person is like, been like, oh, this changed stuff. I mean, I don't know. We've had me and Ezra talked about my book, Your Black Friend, and the way that Black art in particular is tokenized and sort of like used in this way where people feel good because they read it. And I think that's different than actually learning something. But I think also that sort of reveals sort of like a potential sort of shallowness with art in a sort of a constructed thing. It's like, you make beats and it has to end in some sort of way, with a joke or something. If I got 4 panels, it's like, it's got to be contained.
Or
I guess.
Go ahead.
I was going to say too, like, I guess something I struggle with that I definitely like, I think I was raised with this sort of idea that art can create sort of like a laboratory for us to sort of like present ideas and like whatever and address them. And I think a part of me is into that, and another part of me feels like I don't care about it. I think it sort of is like, feels sometimes like an expression of sort of this like Western chauvinist thing where it's like, oh, like the best ideas went out, which I don't think is actually, is self-evident, that's not true. Like, I don't think we would have a lot of things if the best ideas were the things that went out. I guess for me, like, I guess going back to the metaphor, like, I find myself, because I don't feel like we're really in a unique moment in a lot of ways, it's like, I'm like, what sort of complicated ideas that I really like that are sort of like an extension of like prior. Oh, someone's wearing a crowd of motion.
That's a 13th Street is a little loud in DC right now. I'll mute.
Okay. I thought that was like, yeah, a sign from God that I was boring. But like, so I was thinking, for me, it's like we are in a unique moment, like this current uprising that some people call riots is very much, it reminds me of LA riots, or reminds me of Watts riots. You know what I mean? Like, it reminds me of so many things. And for me as an entertainer, like certain things like the positions of the first, or like, you know, some NAACP figure that was like, peace is cool, but I'm gonna shoot me a Klan member because they're coming to my house. Like, I find myself like wanting to sort of arm people with this prior knowledge of how people have historically sort of dealt with moments like this, rather than just sort of like being like, all right, well, you know, why are the Klan coming to the door? You know what I mean? Like, I feel like we know, and I don't find myself in my own subjectivity feeling like I need to sort of give air to that.
Comics are by nature, and arguably an exception for you know, single panel editorial cartooning, though you know, all of you have played with both in one way or another. Comics are fundamentally a medium of simultaneously of rupture and of continuity. What a comic asks a reader to do is to trace and invent the relationship between two discontinuous images. I'm deeply skeptical personally of the idea that reading is enough, and I say that as someone whose doctorate is in English literature. But you know, I mean, I think about an essay by Lauren Michelle Jackson that ran in Vulture recently about the kind of uselessness of anti-racist reading lists, or similarly a piece by Trey Johnson that ran in my own section at the Washington Post Outlook about the limits of, you know, starting a book club when there are people marching outside your house. So I don't want to like push this too far, but to some extent, that movement of jumping over the gutter between two panels, that movement of saying this image and this image, these words and these words have some relationship to one another, asks the reader to start doing some work, start putting things together, start tracing new passageways. And I mean, I do wonder about that question, you know, is any of this work really changing anyone's mind? I also wonder, though, does it have to? Or is part of the function of comics of the kind that all of you do in all of your very different ways to make people think differently, think more, make new connections, myelinate new neurons about the issues that they're already grappling with every day?
Oh.
That's it.
Can I jump in? I'm sorry.
Please.
I wanted to also, it sort of responds to what Ezra was saying as well. I got this great fan letter about a month ago from the mother of a 10-year-old girl who saw my Trump book, which looks like a fun comic book on the cover. It looks very, I mean, it's violent, but it looks like a fun old-timey comic book. And the daughter really wanted this. And the mother who was writing me said, I really didn't think it was appropriate, but she just begged and begged to have it. So they brought the book home, they read it over, they talked about all the issues, because I talk about all of his opinions, all of his unpleasant statements. Anyway, the mother and the daughter talked about the book over time. And then this Mother's Day, the daughter made parodies of my book where she drew comic book covers and inserted Trump and used quotes that she found from wiki quotes. And the mom was like, this is the best Mother's Day present I ever got. And the kid is inspired to make comics. It's like, I couldn't ask for more. Like, they talked about this stuff. The kid is, you know, the kid was engaged in the material. And I mean, I've never had that happen before that I can remember. It was really awesome. So I'm getting choked up.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, like as much as I become disenchanted with the value of what I'm doing and spending all day, every day working on, I'm not going to stop because I enjoy it. And it's like one thing that I'm good at. And I think like Bob was saying, like when you get a letter like that from someone that was affected, like you can work for 10 years on a project and get one letter like that. And you're like, it was all worth it. I'll do it all over again. But I think the thing, like, as far as like the political value of what I'm doing, I think that's more what I'm becoming disenchanted with. But as far as communicating to people and making connections to people, like that's never going to get old. I'm always going to keep doing that. Even if the only value of what I'm doing is to entertain people who already think just like me, that still has value.
I think there's one other thing that we have to think about what our work does make of value is just the historical part of it. You know, I mean, when I say that my stuff doesn't change people's minds, I do believe that. I don't think editorial cartoons change people's minds. I like to think that they generate discussion, but I don't think I can ever think of a time somebody wrote me and said, "Oh my goodness, your work changed my mind." But they're also a historical record of what's going on, and people after we are all dead, they will look at your work and they'll say, you know, they'll look at it and say, what was going on in the country's mind at that time. I mean, It's sort of, that is kind of our role as well, to kind of document, you know. Yeah,
when you said that earlier, that was the thing that resonated the most for me in this whole conversation. Sorry, everybody else that's in this conversation, but this idea that like we're leaving a paper trail for our position, for our grandkids to look back on and be like, oh, what was Anne doing during this time? To be like, oh, she was actually like critiquing the stuff that was going on. Like she was on the side of right, where I feel like that has huge value. It's a selfish value, but that has huge value. I feel like for me, like if I ever have kids, my great grandkids can be like, what was Ezra doing in 2019? And look at Bottom Feeders, be like, whoa, he put out this book that critiques education. Like great granddad was one of the real ones.
I think that can happen in real time, though. I'm going to have to say that I think that can happen in real time. You know, because if you're doing your job well, you're starting these conversations, you're inviting people into conversations, and the only way to have an ignorant person realize that they're ignorant, if they're going to, is to give them challenging material that makes them all of a sudden dumbstruck and that they can't come up with the answer. How many of us have learned from that? I mean, that's sort of why I live in the world. To sort of be a C student that goes around and is not fully bright and asking questions and willing to just say, you know, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's something interesting, like Jacob was saying earlier about like the interactivity of comics and how people feel like they're more engaged with comics because they are filling in that space between the gutters.
Yeah.
Just to push back a little bit on what you were saying, Fish, about the dialogue that we have with our readers and the rise of conspiracy theories specifically. And I feel like people get engaged with conspiracy theories partly because they're putting the pieces together on their own. Yeah, like they're not reading a comic that says George Soros is paying all the protesters. Isn't that funny or whatever? Like they're putting these ridiculous pieces, obviously from YouTube videos together, but they're making those connections. So like the conspiracy theories are vastly more interactive even than comics. And for that reason, I think they're potentially more effective. So maybe we should all be writing conspiracy theories.
Well, that to me speaks to the problem of the health of satire right now, and also how people engage with art. I mean, if you look at some of the greatest satire is just Jonathan Swift. Let's just talk about the Modest Proposal. It was anonymous, you know, and it was constructed in a way that says that the poor people can actually help the rich English. We're talking about the poor in Ireland by basically selling their babies and children to be cooked and fed to feed the elite. As an economic plan, it actually makes sense.
Sorry, Fish. I'm just getting reports from Twitter as you say this that you have just been canceled.
It's a great. And then there's a siren.
So, I'll mute that. We just for what it's worth, we just have a moment or two, a few minutes left. But
okay. I was just going to finish the point about just with satire. Satire has actually a long history of creating these, what one would look at as a conspiracy theory, but these alternative realities that test the ability of the critical thinking of society. And I think that happens less and less and less. so that it's very hard to create satire that is effective and educational, because people are willing to be ignorant about it and then see it as politically incorrect and then try to shut down your voice. So I think that the problem is systemic and very,
that's another panel we need to have. Talk about that. I agree.
Well, I wonder if just in the interest of wrapping up, and I very much enjoying this conversation, so I'm sorry to have to cut us off, but if you all have final thoughts, where do we go from here? Where does all of this leave us? What can we do with comics, if anything, or nothing?
Wow.
Sure, Ben.
For me, I'd like to make comics that get people to stop reading and go out into the streets. You know, like I started doing political comics during a student uprising at this institution I was locked up in. And a key part was making art and dialogue, and it all fed into how we resisted and how we thought about ourselves. So for me, that's like, I feel like I've been spending like the last probably 20 years trying to get back to that.
Man.
Ezra?
Where do we go from here?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think I have to say this to anybody in this room, because I think everybody here is doing work that's important. But I feel like this is something that I think about every time I go to Comic-Con, which is that there's so many people doing work that has no value other than to distract. And just thinking about the difference between entertainment and escapism and distraction, I just don't think there's any difference there. So I feel like one thing I'm always telling people is like, everybody has a pulpit. I think what Anne was saying about people feeling entitled to express their opinions and stuff and reach out to you via social media, like everybody has a pulpit now more than ever. And if you don't use that pulpit to try to make the world a better place or try to affect some positive social change, then that pulpit is completely wasted. So I feel like that is the thing that's changing the most, or that's the most different now versus even 5 years ago, is that everyone feels entitled and qualified to have a pulpit, but nobody's using that pulpit to actually affect positive change.
Yeah. Where do we go from here?
You know, I have to be honest with you. I'm just drawing as fast as I can. I have never been in a position where I've had to throw out ideas, because, I mean, usually, especially around summertime, editorial cartoonists are looking for subjects because Congress is out and nothing's going on. And I'm not overestimating this. It's ever since Trump has gotten in office, it's gotten worse and worse. And as we all know, the news cycle is not only weekly now, it's not daily, it's hourly, and it's crazy. And so I just feel like I'm holding on. I honestly feel that way personally. I am just holding on until something happens. You know, and that's all I can do. You know, I just can't think about it too hardly. I just work as fast as I can.
Mr. Fish?
I think that I treat your audience like your friends. You know, when you're angry and upset, be angry and upset. Always know that there's a good opportunity to have an inappropriate joke thrown in. You know, keep yourself likable so people keep listening to what you have to contribute to a difficult conversation, which is only going to become more and more difficult.
And finally, Bob?
I'm remembering a quote that I heard Sue Coe say once, the political artist who's also done a number of illustrated books. All her work is very political. And someone once asked her, you know, do you think you're speaking to the choir? And she said, the choir needs reinforcement. So I think that's something to keep in mind, that even if we just keep doing what we're doing, there's still an audience there that needs reinforcement, that needs encouragement, and that's got its own value.
Well, it has been such a pleasure speaking with all of you. I wish that we could talk for many hours more. You all do brilliant work. I hope that anyone who is listening to this goes out and reads all of it. And thanks again. It's been fun.
Great. Thank you so much.
Guys.
Great to meet you guys.
Yeah,
You too.
Mhm.